Palo Duro Canyon, Texas, September 1889. The autumn sun was a merciless hammer, beating the red dust into a fine powder that coated every surface. Down on the canyon floor, where the prairie dogtown fork of the Red River snaked lazily through the cottonwoods, the air was still and hot. But up on the rim, a different kind of construction was taking place, one that drew the scorn of every seasoned hand on the sprawling cattle operation. Concepción Albarral, a widow not yet 30, was building her home not on the flat, sensible prairie, but wedged into a narrow, V-shaped notch in the canyon wall itself. Teft Mulder, the range foreman, reined in his horse, the leather of his saddle creaking in protest. He watched with a mixture of pity and profound irritation. Two of his best hands, Jed and Colby, sat their mounts beside him, their expressions mirroring his own. They saw a woman wrestling heavy timbers into a space that was more crevice than building site. The back wall of her cabin was the raw, vertical face of the canyon. The north and west sides were formed by the tight embrace of the notch, leaving only the south and east faces exposed. It looked less like a home and more like a trap. "She's building a coffin and doesn't know it," Jed muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the hot rock. "First good rain, that notch'll turn into a funnel. Wash her and those kids clear to Oklahoma." Mulder nodded, his jaw tight. He'd tried to reason with her. He'd offered her a perfectly good spot near the main bunkhouse, timber already cut and stacked. She had politely refused, her English quiet but firm. "The wind," was all she had said, gesturing to the endless expanse of the high plains. "Here there is no wind," Colby snorted. "No wind? Hell, Teft. A panhandle norther blows from every direction at once. That rock ain't gonna stop it. It's just gonna make it colder. She's a foolish woman." They watched as she painstakingly fitted a log, her movements economical and precise, utterly oblivious to their judgment. The consensus among the men was clear. The quiet Spanish woman was crazy, driven to madness by sun and grief. Her strange little cabin, tucked into the rock like a tick on a dog, was proof. What did this Andalusian cave house builder, a woman who knew the deep, abiding silence of living inside the earth, understand about convective heat loss that a lifetime of Texas ranchers and carpenters had missed? The answer to that question would not only save her family, but would eventually be written into the ledgers of the most powerful cattle operations in the Panhandle. It's a story about the physics of shelter and the quiet wisdom that often looks like madness to the uninitiated. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand why the greatest enemy in a cold climate isn't the temperature, it's the wind. If you find this kind of practical, historical problem-solving fascinating, consider subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional but effective shelter you've ever seen? Concepción Albarral was not a carpenter. She was not a frontierswoman, not in the way the other settlers were. Before Texas, there was Andalusia, in southern Spain. Her life had been lived not on vast, open plains, but in a village of casas cueva, cave houses dug into the soft limestone hills of Granada. She was a woman who understood the language of stone, the thermal inertia of the earth, the way a ton of rock could hold the sun's warmth long after sunset. Her husband, a stonemason, had taught her the craft not of stacking wood, but of hollowing earth. He had filled her head with talk of thermal mass, of shelter from the searing Solano wind, of the deep, profound quiet that came from having the planet itself as your roof. They had come to America seeking land, but he had found a grave instead, taken by a fever in a dusty rail town. Concepción was left with two children, Mateo and Sofia, and a knowledge base utterly alien to the Texas Panhandle. Her first winter had been the crucible, that forged her radical idea. She'd spent it in a standard board and batten shack provided by the ranch owner, a structure considered perfectly adequate by local standards. It was a nightmare. That winter of 1888 was a lesson in the tyranny of wind. The cabin stood exposed on the plain, a lonely target for the ceaseless gales. The first norther hit in late November. It peeled a dozen shingles from the roof as if they were wood chips. The sound was a constant, shrieking roar that vibrated through the very timbers of the house. Inside, every action was a battle against the cold. The fire in the small iron stove roared day and night, consuming a staggering amount of precious cottonwood. Concepción and the children, Mateo and Sofia, fed it constantly, yet the heat seemed to vanish the moment it left the stove. The walls were freezing to the touch. Frost formed on the heads of the nails inside the cabin. The wind found every crack, every seam around the single window and the ill-fitting door. The latch, warped by the cold and pressure, would often fly open in the night with a violent bang, letting in a blast of Arctic air that sent them scrambling from their beds. They slept in their coats, huddled together under every blanket they owned, and still they shivered. It was a miserable, exhausting existence, a constant state of siege. The problem wasn't the stove, and it wasn't the wood. The problem was the wind. It was a thief, stealing every BTU of heat she produced. She watched the smoke from her chimney. It didn't rise. It was ripped away horizontally, a gray banner of wasted energy. One evening, watching the canvas flap over a broken window pane on the bunkhouse, whip itself to shreds, she remembered her husband's words about the cave dwellings back home. The wind cannot steal what it cannot touch. That winter, she didn't just survive, she observed. She studied the landscape. She walked the canyon rim, feeling the air currents on her face, watching how the snow drifted, noticing where the calm spots were. And she found the notch, a scar in the rock, facing south, just deep enough. The conventional wisdom of the panhandle was to build strong. The bunkhouse and the foreman's cabin were monuments to this philosophy. They were built with thick, hand-hewn cottonwood logs, chinked with a mixture of mud and grass. The roofs were stoutly framed. By the standards of the day, they were well-made structures. And in the brutal cold, they were thermal disasters. Their failure was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of heat transfer. The builders had declared war on the cold, but they had ignored the cold's most powerful general, the wind. The primary mechanism of their failure was convective heat loss. Heat moves in three ways: conduction, through direct contact; radiation, through electromagnetic waves; and convection, through the movement of fluids, like air. On the open prairie, convection was king. A 40-mile-per-hour wind at -10 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't just make it feel colder. It actively strips heat from any surface it touches. Think of it as a relentless river of cold air flowing over the cabins. Every square inch of the outer walls was a point of contact. The wood conducted heat from the inside to the outside surface, and the wind immediately scoured that heat away, carrying it off into the plains. The rate of heat loss was astronomical. Inside Teft Mulder's own cabin, the evidence was everywhere. His wife, Sarah, stuffed rags into the window frames, but a constant draft still made the candle on the table flicker. The floor was an ice rink near the door. To keep the main room at a barely tolerable 50 degrees, their stove consumed nearly a quarter of a cord of wood every week during the coldest spells. The ranch was spending a fortune in labor just to cut and haul wood, only to burn it with shocking inefficiency. The bunkhouse was even worse. With 20 men coming and going, the door was always opening, and the larger space was impossible to heat evenly. The men slept in shifts, with some assigned to feed the two massive stoves all night long. They were fighting a losing battle, throwing fuel into a furnace that was perpetually being drained by the river of wind outside. They had built strong walls, but those walls were standing in the middle of a thermodynamic torrent. Concepcion's plan was different. She wouldn't build a stronger wall. She would get out of the river entirely. Her construction began in the blistering heat of late August. The location was everything. The notch was about 12 feet wide at its mouth and narrowed to 8 feet at the back. Its walls were 20 feet high, sheer red rock. Crucially, it faced due south. This orientation would maximize her exposure to the low winter sun. She didn't have a team of men or draft animals. She had a block and tackle, a mule, her own unyielding strength, and the help of her son, Mateo, who at 8 years old was already learning the physics of leverage. First, she cleared the floor of the notch, leveling it and digging shallow footings down to the solid rock bed. She laid a foundation of the largest, flattest stones she could find, creating a solid, dry base. The back wall of her cabin was simply the canyon face itself. She spent days smoothing it, filling small cracks with a clay mortar, making it a single, solid surface. The north and west walls were the other side of the notch. She had to build only 2 exterior walls, the south-facing front and the short east-facing side. She cut her timbers from the cottonwoods down by the river, using the mule to drag them up the canyon trail. Each log was shorter and lighter than those used for the big bunkhouse, manageable for one woman and a boy. She notched them with an adze and a saw, her movements patient and practiced. As the 2 walls rose, the structure began to take shape. It looked tiny, almost comical, squeezed between the towering rock faces. This was when Teft Mulder made his most serious attempt to intervene. He rode out with 3 hands, not just to mock, but with a genuine, if condescending, sense of duty. He dismounted and approached her, his face grim. "Ma'am," he began, removing his hat. "Concepcion, this has to stop. I can't let you put your children in a death trap." She paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dusty glove. "It is not a trap, Señor Mulder. It is a shelter." "A shelter? Look at it," he said, his voice rising with frustration as he gestured at the narrow opening of the notch above them. "When the snows melt up on the caprock, or we get one of those spring gully washers, all that water is going to pour right down this channel. It'll be a flash flood 10 feet deep. It will crush this cabin like an egg. I've seen it happen." He was right to be concerned. Canyon floods were a real and deadly danger. "I've brought the men. We'll help you move these timbers to the spot I showed you. We can have a proper cabin framed up by the end of the week. For the children's sake." Concepcion looked from his earnest, worried face to the rock walls around her. She then pointed to a series of horizontal lines and debris snags high up on the canyon wall, well above her building site. "The water, it has its memory, Señor," she said quietly. "It has not run here for many, many years. It runs in the big arroyo, 200 yards to the west." She had spent weeks studying the geology of the place, reading the story of water written in the stone. Her minimal response, delivered with serene confidence, only baffled Mulder more. It was like arguing with the rock itself. He saw a stubborn fool. She saw a calculated, informed decision. He shook his head, defeated for the moment. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he said, turning back to his horse. He and his men rode away, leaving her to her work. The mockery lasted for the rest of the autumn, but the validation would last for a generation. She finished the roof, extending it to meet the rock walls on both sides and sealing the joints meticulously with pitch and clay. The result was a small, solid structure, half building and half cave, waiting silently for the test that was to come. To understand the genius of Concepcion's design, you have to understand the physics she was exploiting. The core principle was the creation of a microclimate, a small pocket of reality governed by different rules than the plains above. Her weapon was not insulation, but the elimination of wind. Convective heat loss, the enemy that plagued the bunkhouse, is governed by a simple relationship. The faster the air moves over a surface, the more heat it strips away. The heat transfer coefficient, a measure of how effectively heat is removed, increases dramatically with wind speed. A wall that loses, say, 50 BTUs per hour per square foot in still air might lose 500 BTUs in a 40-mile-per-hour wind. This is why wind chill is so dangerous. The temperature of the air doesn't change, but its capacity to steal your body heat increases tenfold. The bunkhouse was experiencing a building-scale wind chill effect. Its stove was working not just to heat the interior air, but to replace the energy being violently ripped from the exterior walls, a task at which it was bound to fail. Concepcion's Canyon notch acted as a massive windbreak. The 40-mile-per-hour norther screaming across the plains hit the west-facing canyon rim and was deflected upwards and over. It could not dip down into the narrow cut. The air inside the notch became what engineers call a dead air zone. The wind speed at the surface of her cabin walls was effectively zero. This single fact changed the entire thermal equation. By killing the wind, she reduced the primary mode of heat loss by an order of magnitude. Her stove no longer had to fight a hurricane. It only had to compensate for the much slower, more manageable heat loss through conduction and radiation. But she had a second, equally elegant trick up her sleeve: passive solar gain and thermal mass. The cabin faced due south. On a clear winter day, the low-hanging sun would shine directly onto the front of her cabin and, more importantly, onto the massive red rock wall of the canyon that formed the back of her home. Rock has a high thermal mass, meaning it can absorb and store a tremendous amount of heat energy. Throughout the day, that south-facing rock wall would soak up solar radiation, getting warmer and warmer. After sunset, as the air temperature plummeted, that stored heat would begin to radiate back out. Because her cabin was directly connected to that rock face, a significant portion of that radiant energy flowed directly into her living space. The canyon wall became a gentle, low-temperature radiator, warming her home all night long for free. The men on the plains saw her cabin as being trapped by cold rock. They failed to see that the rock was not a heat sink, but a heat battery. She had wedged her home between a windshield and a radiator. The norther arrived on the 3rd of January, 1890. It came not as a gradual cooling, but as a physical wall of air. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single hour. By nightfall, it was minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind began its assault. For 3 days and 3 nights, it did not stop. It was a physical presence, a sound you felt in your bones, a pressure that seemed to want to crush the world. Up on the plain, life at the ranch ground to a halt and became a pure exercise in survival. The wind drove the snow into horizontal sheets, erasing the landscape. Visibility was less than 10 feet. Drifts piled up against the north walls of the bunkhouse, reaching the eaves. Inside, it was a state of emergency. A window pane on the west side shattered, and the men had to nail heavy planks over it while the wind tore at them. The stoves ran white-hot, but the building groaned and shuddered. The temperature inside never rose above 45 degrees. The men stayed in their bunks, fully dressed, piling horse blankets on top of their bedrolls. The simple act of crossing the yard to the foreman's cabin was a life-threatening expedition. In Teft Mulder's house, the situation was just as grim. He and his wife Sarah spent most of their time in the kitchen, the warmest room. But even there, a pan of water left on the floor away from the stove quickly developed a skin of ice. Their wood pile, which they thought would last a month, was disappearing at an alarming rate. The wind was a constant, screaming torment. Mulder found himself thinking of the Spanish widow and her 2 small children. He pictured her foolish cabin, a frozen tomb pounded by the gale, its occupants likely already frozen. He felt a pang of guilt, a sense of failure. He should have forced her to move. He should have torn the damn thing down himself. He pictured the flood he had warned her about, except now it was a flood of wind, and he was certain it had claimed her. Down in the notch, a different reality prevailed. Outside the mouth of the narrow canyon, the blizzard raged. Snow swirled in chaotic vortices. But just 20 feet back, where the cabin stood, the air was almost preternaturally still. Snow fell softly, vertically, piling in neat, undisturbed blankets on the ground and the roof. Inside, Concepción stoked her small stove, but with a slow, measured rhythm. The fire required only a few small logs every hour to keep the single room at a comfortable 65 degrees. The rear wall, the canyon face, was warm to the touch, radiating a gentle, steady heat. There were no drafts, no rattling windows, no shrieking wind. The domestic warmth was proven by the small details of a life uninterrupted. The air smelled of cornbread baking and the faint scent of drying herbs hanging from the rafters. Mateo and Sofia sat at the small wooden table in their shirt sleeves, drawing on a piece of slate, their world confined to a single, warm, quiet room. The only sound from the outside world was a distant, muffled roar like a faraway ocean. The storm was an abstraction, a thing happening to other people. Here there was only peace. On the windowsill, a single tallow candle burned. Its flame, a small yellow teardrop, stood perfectly straight and utterly motionless. On the second night of the storm, Teft Mulder could stand it no more. The guilt was eating him alive. He had to know. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned, wrapped a scarf over his face, and told his wife he was going to check on the widow. She pleaded with him not to go, but his mind was set. The journey of 200 yards from his cabin to the canyon rim was one of the hardest things he had ever done. The wind was a solid force, knocking him off balance, stealing his breath. The cold was a physical pain, burning his exposed cheeks. He followed the faint outline of a fence line, navigating by memory and feel. When he reached the edge of the canyon, he had to crawl on his belly to the spot overlooking her notch, terrified the wind would pick him up and throw him into the abyss. He peered down. What he saw stopped his breath. There was no sign of destruction. Instead, a perfect rectangular column of gray smoke rose from her chimney. It did not whip away horizontally like his own. It rose straight up for 10 feet before the high currents caught it and tore it apart. It was a sign of impossible calm. He scrambled down the trail, half falling, half sliding, his body driven by a desperate need to understand. As he entered the shelter of the notch, the change was instantaneous and profound. The roaring gale ceased. The air became still. The biting pressure on his face vanished. It was like stepping from a hurricane into a closed room. He reached her door and hesitated, catching his breath. He expected to hear the sounds of shivering, of misery. He heard nothing. He knocked. The door opened, and a wave of warm, dry air washed over him. Concepción stood there, her expression calm, unsurprised. Behind her, he could see the children at the table, looking up at him with curiosity. The room was bright, warm, and smelled of baked bread. It was an island of summer in the middle of a polar hell. "Señor Mulder," she said, her voice even, "you are cold? Come in." He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the muffled roar. He was too stunned to speak. He unwrapped the scarf from his face, his skin numb. He looked around the small, impossibly comfortable room. His eyes landed on the windowsill. There sat the candle, its flame a perfect, unwavering spear of light. In his own house, a candle flame danced and flickered as if trying to escape. Here it was as still as a painting. That tiny, steady flame was the most powerful proof he had ever witnessed. It was the physical manifestation of silence. He stayed for nearly an hour, thawing out, drinking a cup of hot, sweet coffee. He asked about her woodpile. She showed him. She had used less than a quarter of the wood he had burned, yet her home was 20 degrees warmer. He placed his bare palm against the back rock wall. He expected the deadly chill of stone. Instead, he felt a deep, penetrating warmth. It was the stored heat of yesterday's sun, still working for her. He walked back to his own cabin in a daze. The wind seemed less angry now, more like a blustering fool. He had spent his life fighting it. Concepción Albarral had simply stepped out of its way. When he returned home, he didn't just tell his wife what he saw. He took out the ranch ledger and a pencil. He began to do the math. Cords of wood burned per day in the bunkhouse versus the widow's cabin. Gallons of kerosene for lamps. Man-hours spent cutting wood. The numbers told a story of staggering waste and profound revelation. As he looked at the figures, the foreman felt a piece of his certainty crack and fall away. He finally understood. You didn't build a wall against the wind. You built a place where the wind doesn't exist. The norther broke on the fourth day. When the sun emerged, the world was a glittering white expanse. The story of Teft Mulder's visit to the widow's cabin spread through the bunkhouse like a grass fire. At first, the men were incredulous, but Mulder was the foreman, a man not given to tall tales. He took the two most skeptical hands, Jed and Colby, down to the notch themselves. They felt the stillness. They felt the warm rock. They saw the tiny woodpile. The conversion was absolute. The mockery died that day, replaced by a quiet, grudging respect that would soon blossom into outright awe. The proof, for men who understood economics better than physics, was in the ledger. Mulder's calculations were stark. Concepcion's cabin, housing 3 people, consumed approximately 1/8 of a cord of wood per week in the coldest weather. The bunkhouse, with its 20 men, was burning through 2 full cords a week to achieve a far lower temperature. It was more than a 16-fold difference in per-person fuel efficiency. When the ranch owner, a pragmatic cattle baron from back east, saw the numbers, he saw not a curiosity, but a revolution in frontier architecture. Labor spent cutting wood was labor not spent mending fences or tending cattle. Fuel was money. That spring, the ranch built 2 new line shacks for cowboys working the distant pastures. They were not built on the open plain. Following Mulder's direction, and with Concepcion's quiet consultation, they were built into south-facing cut banks and rocky outcrops. The designs were crude copies of her original, but they embraced the core principles: wind shelter and passive solar gain. The next winter, the fuel savings were documented in the ranch ledger. The entries read, New West Camp Shack, 1 cord wood, November to February. Old North Camp, 4 cords, November to February. The data was undeniable. Word traveled the way it does on the frontier, through conversations at the general store, through riders carrying mail between ranches. The foreman of the J.A. Ranch, a sprawling operation to the south, heard the story and rode over to see for himself. He left with a page of notes and a new understanding of shelter. By 1892, the Albarral Notch cabin, as it came to be known, was being replicated across the Texas Panhandle. It was never a widespread style. The specific geography was too rare. But the principle behind it began to sink in. Settlers started building sod houses with their backs dug into hillsides, orienting their new frame houses to take advantage of windbreaks from tree lines, and understanding that a south-facing window was a source of free heat. A quiet immigrant woman had taught an entire region a lesson in thermal dynamics. The simple, elegant solution pioneered by Concepción Albarral in a lonely canyon in 1889 was a precursor to some of the most advanced concepts in modern building science. Today, we call her methods passive solar design, earth-sheltered construction, and wind load mitigation. Architects and engineers use complex computer models to simulate airflow around buildings, seeking to minimize the very convective heat loss that Conception defeated through pure observation and ancestral knowledge. Her use of the canyon wall as a thermal battery is the exact principle behind Trombe walls and other thermal mass heating systems used in eco-friendly homes. She had no scientific instruments, no formal training. She had an inherited wisdom, a deep intimacy with her environment, and the powerful motivation of a mother protecting her children. She proved that the most effective technologies are often not the most complex, but the ones that work in harmony with the forces of nature rather than in opposition to them. In the end, the story of the cabin in the notch is about a fundamental reevaluation of what shelter is. The other settlers saw shelter as a function of the strength of a wall. Their solution to a powerful force was to build a more powerful barrier, a thick log wall, a stout roof, a heavy door. They believed that the integrity of their shelter was contained entirely within the structure they built. Conception understood something deeper. She knew that the most important wall is often the one you don't have to build. She recognized that the landscape itself, the curve of a hill, the shelter of a bluff, the orientation toward the sun, was an integral part of the structure. True shelter wasn't an object you placed in an environment. It was a relationship you created with it. The greatest protection from the wind, she proved, is not a wall that can withstand its force, but a location where the wind simply ceases to be. It is a lesson in humility and wisdom, a reminder that sometimes the most profound act of construction is choosing the right place to be still. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found the science behind this solution as compelling as the human story, please like this video and subscribe for more explorations of historical engineering. We believe the past has practical lessons for the present, and your support helps us bring them to light. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. What other historical building techniques deserve more attention? Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and the physics of heat transfer. The application of any historical building technique in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.